The Philadelphia Church of God presents the Trumpet Daily.
Well, this has been a pretty difficult summer for the United States when you think about the economy. It's been difficult for the politicians in Washington who are signing all of the checks that keep the government and the nation afloat. Of course, we're running into huge amounts of debt and deficit spending. You've seen a lot about that on the news, no doubt. This summer, when we were in Israel in early August, I ran into a friend of mine who produces a radio segment for a station back here in the States, and he's in Israel most of the year producing these segments. And when I bumped into him, he was on his laptop and just glued to the screen, glued to some of the U.S. networks and the news coming from America about the economy. At that time, it was about the debt ceiling that they were arguing over whether to raise. Well, most of them, I think, wanted to raise it, but it had to be according to their specifications, whether you were on the right side or the left side of the aisle. And he was watching that, and I just kind of joked with him saying that, well, I thought you reported mainly on Israel and sent those reports back to the States. And he said, well, you look at what's happening in America, and I mean, this affects everything. It impacts everything. It impacts Israel, and this is why he was glued to the news about that debt ceiling. Now, Congress, as you might remember, was arguing over why they needed to raise it and what would be sort of attached to that raising of the ceiling. I think everyone knew going in it was inevitable that it would rise. It always has. In the last 50 years, in fact, they've raised the debt ceiling 76 times. So I think there was a pretty good indication going in that it was going to raise again. 76 times they've bumped it up in 50 years. So I mean, it's more than once a year. And this argument, this debate will come up again in another year because of the way we're spending money. It'll come up once again. Now, if you look at all of the budgets proposed by the politicians in Washington over the summer, all of them, not one single plan. There wasn't one single plan that set out to fix the yearly deficit, the huge amount of money that we're spending that we don't have, that we just simply have to print off. This massive debt problem, there was no budget really that addressed it. There was some talk, of course, about cuts, and you'll hear a lot about cuts and about balancing the budget. But all you have to do is just look at the numbers, and you see how imbalanced it is. And you see how they don't cut anything, even the ones that are optimistic and that talk about turning these things around. Most of them at least can agree that we're on a dangerous course. But most of them also talk about this optimistic turnaround where the U.S. economy just magically recovers from all of the bottoming out in the house market, the 9 or 10% joblessness, unemployment, that these things will just sort of turn around, and then we'll have all kinds of revenue coming in, and everything will return right back to normal. And then the cuts, really, that are often talked about, they amount to pennies, really. Pennies. If you had millions and millions of dollars, it would be like cutting $10 or $20 here and there, and then patting yourself on the back. That's what it amounts to. When your deficit spending is in the trillions, and you talk about cutting $20 billion may sound like a lot to you and me, but this is pennies in Washington, looking at the amounts of money that they're spending. Just to give you the basic figures, this really is all that you need to understand. These are the bottom line figures. The total value of everything the United States of America produces this year in 2011 will amount to about $15.2 trillion. It's what's called the GDP. That's the total value of the U.S. economy. All right, $15.2 trillion. And of that, the government will collect $2.1 trillion in taxes. That's the government's cut of everything that's produced in the American economy. $2.1 trillion. Now, as for government spending, that amounts to $3.8 trillion. So the government takes in $2.1 trillion and it spends about $3.8 trillion. So if you want to do the math in your head, what does that mean? What do the figures tell you? Well, right off the bat, you learn that we have to borrow $1.7 or so trillion. Either borrow it or, as we're doing increasingly, print it, to print off that money. Just to give you a few simple comparisons to history that really is not that long ago. A few years ago, 3 years ago in fact, the government spent just under $3 trillion, which is an eye-popping figure in itself. It was $2.98 trillion. That was the government budget. This year, as I said, it's $3.8 trillion. So that's an additional $800 billion. $800 billion, almost $1 trillion additional spending, just compared to 2008, just to a few years ago. So when you talk about cutting $20 billion, when you've added that much more spending, it doesn't amount to really anything. Sadly, it doesn't amount to much of anything. 3 years ago, we spent $1.59 trillion in entitlement spending. About $1.6 trillion, just to round it off. This year, we're spending $2.19 trillion in welfare spending, entitlement spending. Again, an additional $600 billion. $600 billion. Now, this summer, you may have also seen in the news how that the government's overall debt, the debt that we've accumulated, is now larger than America's GDP. It's now larger than all of the money flowing in the American economy each year, that 15.2 trillion figure. The U.S. debt, the debt clock that you sometimes hear about, that's now surpassed America's GDP. It's the first time that this has happened since the World War II era, and as Mr. Morley wrote about at thetrumpet.com, that was a crisis back then as well. But there's a few huge differences between then and now. For one, many of America's competitors were bombed into rubble at that time. And so many nations, of course, at that time also owed the United States money because we were lending money back then. Today, we're the world's biggest borrower. So there's some significant differences between then and now. For those that would say, oh, well, we got through it in World War II, surely we can do it again. It's different this time, particularly when you look at those two factors that I just mentioned, and also just the fierce competition and the desire among nations outside of the United States, the desire for them to see us take a downfall. Now, so many of them I know are attached to this economy. So many of them I know have been for years feeding off of the American consumer, China and other nations like that. So for sure, they've got a vested interest in keeping the consumers in America spending and spending and spending. But their first concern is about their future welfare, their future. And when they see that the well is running dry in America, don't expect for them to reach out with a helping hand. Don't expect that. We can't expect that. Now, you talk about passing America's GDP just this summer. In a few years from now, that $15 trillion of debt is going to seem like just a small sum comparatively. Because even in the budgets that are being projected over the next 10 years or so, they put that debt at about 25, 26, 27 trillion dollars just in the next few years. Back in February, when the White House released its budget for this year, 2011, this is how the budget director, Jack Lew, defended the eye-popping figures that were released to the public. He says the way we've dealt with it for most of the last decade is simply to put the expense on our national credit card and to kick the can down the road. He says, well, this budget says we can't do that anymore. The budget that we sent to Congress today is a responsible plan that shows that we can live within our means and we can also invest in the future. Now, I want to refer you back to the figures that I just gave to you. The revenue, the money that the government takes in, $2.1 trillion, and the budget that they submitted back in February spent or was planning to spend $3.8 trillion. And it was spoken of as if this was somehow fiscally responsible, that it was a wise investment into the future, and that it was showing that we could live within our means, when it's exactly the opposite. We're not living within our means. That's the problem, you see. That's the problem. We're living way beyond our means. Last year, we had about the same size of budget, $3.8 trillion. We've been going strong at this for the last 2 or 3 years in particular. And that's not to say it was good or it was a tight belt during the years of the Bush administration. I mean, the spending then was crazy as well. But I mean, it really has gone off into the deep end since the crisis of 2008. And then now with the new administration in there, just spending wildly. This is how President Obama defended the budget that they released last year, which, as I said, was also about $3.8 trillion. He said it eliminated waste, it froze spending, and included painful cuts. Notice what he says. It's time to hold Washington to the same standards families and businesses hold themselves. It's time to save what we can, spend what we must, and live within our means once again. See, nothing but cheap talk. And they've gotten pretty good at that in Washington in recent years. Let's look at Proverbs 22 and see what God has to say about this kind of deficit spending and where it's leading. I'm going to read to you some quotes here in just a second from many of the leading voices, economists, leaders, politicians, investors, that talk about the United States as if everything's going to be okay. Nothing bad could possibly happen from all of this. When in fact our country, students, our country is facing the worst crisis we've experienced since the Great Depression. And I told you, as Mr. Morley brings out in one of his recent articles, how it was different back then than today. We've got to wake up to what's happening. Most Americans are asleep to these facts. Most Americans think that it'll go on just fine because of their credit card mentality. Because when one of theirs maxes out, they can always get a new card in the mail. For them, it makes sense that they can just keep spending. And it's the same mentality that's afflicted those that are in Washington, sad to say. There's no wisdom, there's no understanding when it comes to these sound financial principles. We've passed the point of no return. This is not something that we can just run off trillions of $1 bills and then be okay, off the printing press, I mean. We've passed that point of being able to fix this. God says here in Proverbs 22, verse 7, the borrower is servant to the lender. See, we're now the biggest debtor nation. We used to be the biggest lender, which is why so many nations, going back to World War II even, were our servants, quote unquote. Now we serve them because we're borrowing from them. Now we bow before them because they're lending to us, because they're enabling us to spend. On August 5th, you probably read about the credit rating of the United States being downgraded. We lost our AAA rating for the first time in our history. Why is it we're hearing so much about this is the first time it's happened in history? This is the first time that the debt The levels of debt have surpassed the GDP. This is the first time we've lost our AAA rating. Why do we keep hearing statements like this? Now, Standard & Poor made sure to release its report at the end of the week. It was Friday night a few weeks ago when they released this, because they knew it would send shockwaves through stock markets all over the world. So they released that news, and then sure enough, we experienced the tops and turns and twists of all the markets around the world the following week. But what was interesting, perhaps one of the more interesting or revealing stories to come out of that, was the way China, who lends us so much money, reacted to that downgrade, talking about the United States being addicted to debts, and they're right about it. We are addicted. It's an addiction. Debt spending. This idea that you can just keep spending and spending and spending. The China news agency said that China had the right to demand that America learn to live within its means. Why does China have this right? Because they're lending us the money. And so just like a bank, if you borrowed a lot of money from a bank and then you started really getting into some serious financial trouble, missed a few payments here and there, the creditors would come knocking. The bank would say, hey, you've got to get things in order, or we're going to come and take your house. That's the way it is in the real world. And that's what China was saying a few weeks ago. If America doesn't tighten its belt, China warned, the downgrade would prove to be only a prelude to more devastating credit rating cuts. That's what China said a few weeks ago. Now, anyone with an ounce of common sense would know that when that S&P downgrade came out, it was like a warning sign to America. And we've had so many in recent months, in recent years. I mean, those alarms have been going off over and again as we pass these dubious milestones. Yet, despite the downgrade, as I said, most Americans just think that, well, we don't really have a serious problem. And even more shameful than that is that most of our leaders, the ones that have gone to college and universities to learn about the economy, about how businesses run, the economists, as I said, the leaders, the politicians, the investors. This is what President Obama said after the downgrade. He said, markets will rise and fall, but this is the United States of America. No matter what some agency may say, we have always been and always will be a AAA country. This is the U.S. of A. That's the thinking. We're always going to be a AAA country. We're the great United States. It doesn't matter what an agency says. That's a sign, you see, of addiction. Think about all those reports, as Mr. Hilliker wrote in an article at the website, Trumpet.com, about American school kids, how that they're lagging behind in all of the test scores, and yet we're Americans, the children in school are so much farther along than their competitors internationally, is in self-esteem. They think they're great. They think they're doing well. They think everything's going fantastic. They think they're smart. Smarter than others, perhaps. That's the kind of thinking that you see in Washington. Our problems, the president said, are eminently solvable, and we know what we have to do to solve them. We know what we do. We know what we have to do to solve these problems, he says. You go across the aisle, they would say the same thing. We know what we need to do here to solve this. It's really easy to fix. And look at the problems as they continue to mount. After that downgrade, that was on a Friday night. I think it was on Sunday then, a couple of days later, when the former Federal Reserve Bank Chairman, Alan Greenspan, he was in that position for years, and he couldn't understand why we were downgraded, and he couldn't understand, to a large degree, why there was such a big fuss over these reports. He said regarding the downgrade that the United States can pay any debt because we can always print money to do that. Now that was one of the leading economists of our day back during the Clinton and Bush administrations, that we can take care of anything because we can always fall back on printing more money. Imagine if you had that option. You just went to the college bookstore or bought a house next to the campus as a second place to live when things got a little stressful in the dorm. And you had this massive printing press in your living room and you thought, well, hey, if we run into problems, we can just print more money. It's always fixable. It'll always keep going. That's the kind of childish reasoning that's coming from the men that ought to be leading us through this crisis, preparing us for the danger that's ahead, sounding the alarm about the iceberg that's in front of us. Warren Buffett, he said the downgrade doesn't make sense. He too reasoned that, well, we can always print more money. What about Timothy Geithner? He's the one that said we'd never lose our AAA rating, by the way. So he's reliable. His word is reliable, right? He said the S&P has a stunning lack of knowledge about basic U.S. fiscal budget math. There's no risk, he said later, there's no risk the United States would ever not be in a position to meet its obligations. Don't worry, S&P, there's no risk here. We'll always meet our obligations. You start hearing words like always and never coming out of the mouths of politicians, and what do you suppose is about to happen? Where is there an ounce of humility in these statements? These are leaders, students. And I say this to you because, in truth, you are the future leaders of society. You are the future leaders of this world. And we've always got to go back to what God says about financial health, about how economies can function and work and thrive, and how they fall apart. The media, of course, jumped on with the same message, just echoing what people on both sides of the aisle were saying. The New York Times, there's no reason to take Friday's downgrade of America seriously. These are the last people whose judgment we should trust. Speaking of the S&P, just disregard it, ignore it. Well, the world didn't ignore it. China didn't ignore it. But that's what the leaders in America want for us to do, to just forget about it and move on and keep running up the card debt. Even the more conservative publications, we can look over at Psalm 37 if you want to turn over there. A couple of the conservative publications, the Wall Street Journal, despite S&P's opinion, there is no chance that America will default on its debts. There's no chance that it's going to happen. National Review, that's a pretty conservative publication. Do not panic, it said. The growing fear of U.S. recession may not pan out. Our financial system is in vastly better shape than it was in September 2008. He says vastly better shape. It's much better today than it was in 2008 when we saw all those problems in the housing market and in the banking industry. It's much more sound today. It's much more solid today. Look at what it says, though, here in Psalm 37, verse 21. In the Revised Standard Version, it says, "The wicked borrows and cannot pay back, but the righteous is generous and gives." See, we just keep on borrowing, and God says that's a sign, that's a trait of wickedness, wicked behavior. The wicked borrows and cannot pay back. And really, in some of those statements I just read to you, there was almost an admission, wasn't there, that they couldn't pay back the debts. When they talk about, well, we can always fall back on just printing more money, that's not really paying back your debts, is it? How is that? How's that in treating your creditors by just printing off all this money? And what does that do to the value of the dollar? What does that do to the investment? Looking at it from China's perspective, I mean. How will they react to that? They're going to look at that sort of thing as a sign of war, trade wars. How do you suppose these nations that are lending the money will react, or what do you think they'll think about the United States, the great United States of America that's always going to have its AAA rating in our eyes, in our minds? That's not the way the rest of the world sees it, though. Mr. Armstrong, Herbert W. Armstrong, wrote back in the 1980s about this very crisis that we're experiencing. He said then, and we say now, to prepare for what's ahead, to prepare to reduce your standard of living, as Mr. Armstrong said. This is from 1983. Today, Britain has lost her empire. Britain has been on the way down in national wealth and power since World War I, and now the United States is starting to follow on the downward path. There was a time, not very long ago, when the British would have thought and said some of the very same things that we're seeing come out of Washington today. We'll always be a AAA country. We'll always be a AAA empire. Well, the mighty pound, it's always going to be the reserve currency. We'll always be the most powerful empire in the world. And look at Britain today. The United States, as Mr. Armstrong says there, is following that same path.
In looking at the state of America's economy today, there really isn't much good news that we can pass along to you, but there are definite steps that you, individually, can take that are very positive and very hopeful. Call the number on your screen and ask for this new booklet, Solve Your Money Troubles. Solve Your Money Troubles. People these days are always on the hunt for sound financial advice. Books about managing your money line the shelves in bookstores. There are infomercials, radio programs, all of them offering financial advice. Everyone has an opinion, and everyone, it seems, is looking for answers. This little booklet gives you God's all-important perspective. Regardless of financial condition and regardless of surrounding economic conditions, in fact, you can prosper, but to do so, you must take certain concrete action. Sacrifices must be made, at least for the short term, but the result will be a happier, less stressful lifestyle. Are you ready to experience the financial freedom, the peace of mind, and the abundant, joy-filled life that directly result from practicing God's laws on finance? Then call the number on your screen and ask for this booklet, Solve Your Money Troubles. When you do, we'll also send you this other little booklet as well. It's called The Financial Law That You Can't Afford to Ignore. Now, both of these booklets have just recently been printed. They're brand new offerings, and best of all, both of them are offered at no cost to you. There's no cost or obligation for you. Just pick up the phone and make that request. Also, remember to visit our sister site at thetrumpet.com every day. Thetrumpet.com helps you properly understand the events of this world under the clear light of Bible prophecy. That's thetrumpet.com, or if you're not into the internet, you can get a subscription to the Trumpet magazine, also if you call the number on your screen. We thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you again next time.